Hello, everybody. Welcome to the side event on scaling MDB support for sovereign financing priorities, integrated national financing frameworks, and country platforms, bringing them together. So really welcome to the side event and co-hosted by the government of Spain and the INFF facility, which includes UNDP, UNDESA, UNICEF, the OECD, the EU, Italy, Spain, and Sweden. I'm Sherry Spiegel. I'm the Director of the Financing for Sustainable Development Office at UNDESA, and I'll be moderating. And I'm going to hand over the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Monica Colomor, Ambassador at Large for Financing for Development from Spain, for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Sari. So nice to be here among so many friendly faces. So it's a pleasure for Spain. And thank you for the invitation to participate in this critical dialogue on integrated national financing frameworks and their role in advancing sustainable development. Spain remains strongly committed to the success of INFFs as transformative tools for financing the sustainable development goals. As the host of FfD4 and a dedicated partner of INFF facility, Spain supports the development and the implementation of INFFs to ensure financing aligns with national priorities, fosters resilience, and drives impactful, sustainable progress. We look forward to working together to strengthen country leadership in financing for development and furthering the success of these frameworks. To ensure that success of the INFFs, it will be necessary to reinforce the following aspects. First, it will be necessary to align development and climate priorities through integrated approaches. INFFs serve as an essential framework not only for integrating SDG into national budgets, but also for creating synergies between climate targets, such as NDCs under the Paris Agreement, and other development goals. As the host of FfD4 and a financial contributor to the INFF facility, Spain emphasized the importance of INFFs in developing national strategies that embedded climate resilience and mitigation, aiming to catalyze resources towards sustainable, climate-smart development pathways. Secondly, through partnership like the Spain-UNDP Alliance, Spain is advocating for MDBs to support country-led financing strategies and to scale up their investment in alignment with national financing strategies. As stated by the concept note, there is growing momentum behind the scaling up of country platforms for coordinating MDBs and other partners' engagement at the country level. It is important to find effective ways to bring INFFs together with country platforms. Moreover, a global collaborative co-financing platform was launched in partnership with other MDBs to improve coordination and identify co-funding opportunities. This platform should use INFFs to match demand with supply. Finally, MDBs play a pivotal role in supporting the development and operationalization of INFFs by providing technical expertise, financial resources, policy guidance, and coordination with other stakeholders. Third, there is a need to promote private sector participation in INFF. INFFs coordinate fiscal policies and regulatory frameworks that encourage private investment towards SDG-aligned projects. This approach supports innovation like sustainably linked bonds and climate-focused financing instruments. In addition, INFFs are fostering inclusivity and accountability. The multi-stakeholder nature of INFFs brings diverse actors, local governments, private sector, civil society into the dialogue, ensuring the inclusiveness and transparency of financing strategies. This is especially important for advancing a sustainable development at local levels and achieving territorial cohesion. Finally, in the preparation of the INFFs, the action should not only come from the countries of the developing countries that need to finance their development, but also from the donors, whether they are committed to share fiscal information or increase technical assistance or on taxation or commitments on debt sustainability. In short, these points can guide a comprehensive approach that in the road to Sevilla emphasize the use of INFFs to drive sustainable climate resilient financing for SDGs, broadening stakeholder engagement and scaling investment aligned with national priorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your comments and for your opening, for starting us off on a really good note. The INFFs were actually first introduced in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. And the idea, for those of you who don't know that much about it, maybe everyone does, and then apologies for talking about the basics, but the idea is actually very simple. It was that we saw that countries were beginning to integrate sustainable development even when the SDGs were still being formulated. They were beginning to integrate it into their national development strategies, but most of these were not financed. And so it was clear that, that there was a need for thinking through how do you ensure sustainable plans are financed, and INFFs were just a framework simply to incorporate financing into the national sustainable development strategies. And actually, in the early years when we were working on this, we worked with this very, very closely with the World Bank. So the initial thinking was really done closely together. The idea is for these plans to be completely country-owned and led by countries as part of their planning processes. They're called integrated because not only are they integrating the three dimensions of sustainable development, environmental, social, and economic, but you also need to financing. One of the clear things about this whole FFD process is financing is not just about money. Financing is about policies, and different policies will lead to different financing gaps depending on what policies you put in place. And so you really need to, in INFFs, bring the whole government together. You need to bring finance together with planning, sometimes with environment. So the idea is to really have an integrated approach to how does one finance the sustainable development strategy. Now, by now, 85 countries are using this approach, and the number is expected to grow. And I think the other thing that's become really clear is how important, even more important than realized in 2015, is how important these nationally led plans really are, especially as we run into new and growing challenges and systemic risks, global systemic risks. You'll see in the outcome document, well, you can't see this as much, but INFFs were very prominent in the inputs. So as you know, the co-facilitators received around 300 inputs, and that included, there were quite a few inputs on INFFs. And as laid out in the inputs, INFFs are primarily a country planning tool, but they can also be used as a tool to strengthen development cooperation and development cooperation architecture, and also maybe even a tool with private finance issues. So the elements paper calls for under the development cooperation chapter, there's a call for rationalization of the national level architecture. And within that, INFFs play a role along with platforms. So there's a call for platforms at the country level to bring all the donors together, and really a call for using these platforms. So country platforms, as you know, were proposed through the G20 initially, and the G20 Task Force for the Global Mobilization Against Climate Change ministerial statement of October 2024, for example, supports the voluntary use of country platforms. In the elements paper, there's a call to go further, to think about bringing together the MDBs, also development finance institutions on the national level, bilateral donors as well, and the UN system as well, and to bring all of these together on the ground. But one of the things that I think is very clear, and is clear in almost every discussion, is that if you have such platforms, there has to be, how do you keep these country-owned? Everyone knows they should be country-owned, but it's a real challenge to make them country-owned. And as some of our developing country partners say, this is a great idea because of the increased fragmentation, but we also don't want them to become a place of even more skewed balance power issues. So how do we ensure that countries are in the driver's seat And for that, I think the first step is to have a strong plan that's really a country-owned plan. So the idea of bringing a kind of plan together with the platform seems to make a lot of sense, and that's put forward by the co-facilitators in the Elements paper. So it really calls on placing developing countries in the driver's seat with country-led plans and strategies at the core of platforms, and ensuring that these plans and strategies are at the heart of development partner collaboration. So this is the topic we're here to discuss today at the side event, and we really have an excellent panel to talk us through it. And so we're going to go straight to the panel discussion, and I'm first going to call on Her Excellency, I think it's via video, Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, the Minister of Planning, Economic Development, and International Cooperation in Egypt, and I hope the video is working. Is the video working?
No, it's not.
No.
Sorry, 1 second. Thanks, Tim. Thanks.
Tim, for those of you who didn't hear, Tim just said they tested it, or we tested it, and it worked in testing, but. I saw a light. Great, welcome. We can't, let's start.
Excellencies, distinguished panelists and partners, as we prepare for the upcoming 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, it is my pleasure to address you today at this timely and significant discussion led by the government of Spain and the INFF facility parties on the crucial role of multilateral development banks in supporting for sovereign financing priorities through integrated national financing frameworks and country platforms. Our gathering today, after the adoption of the Pact for the Future, formulation of the preliminary Financing for Development Elements paper, as well as COP29 and many international fora, comes at the crossroads of many global and regional developments. Member states are in a rush to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, while the global financial architecture is changing. The extreme and multidimensional poverty, unstable global economic environment, climate change, armed conflicts, indebtedness, food insecurity, inefficient management of natural resources, as well as global pandemics and many other challenges have tightened fiscal conditions and threatened the capacity of national systems around the world. The road to 2030 became full of difficulties, especially for developing countries and emerging economies, to fulfill the international commitments by 2030, while preserving our own development gains. The funding gap has surpassed $6 trillion. On average, only 6% of the SDG targets are on track to be met globally by 2030, with the remaining 84% showing limited progress or reversal of progress, according to the Sustainable Development Report 2024. Now, more than ever, it is time for us to think outside the box, utilize innovative and unconventional financial solutions that would allow developing nations to avoid the dilemma of choosing between debt servicing and social progress. The UN Deputy Secretary General has determined 6 transitions to accelerate the SDGs based on global evidence, including food systems, energy access and affordability, digital connectivity, education, jobs and social protection, and finally, climate change. We have to work together and take these as guidance for tailoring our national key transitions and drivers of change. The increased access to innovative and just financial mechanisms such as blended finance, debt swap programs for development, empowered by country-led platforms that bring the national development priorities to the forefront of implementable solutions, have proven its effectiveness during the past period. De-risking mechanisms are a key requisite for attracting private capital, resulting in not just increased financing in prioritized economic sectors, but also allowing for allocation of public spending on human development. Public investment governance and structural reforms stimulate private sector participation in leading development efforts. The investment guarantee modalities are essential. I acknowledge the World Bank Unified Guarantee Platform and the EU Investment Guarantee Mechanism that provided additional channels for financing Egypt's private sector. Many of the international financial institutions invested approximately $900 million in Egypt's private sector companies during November 2024 alone, spanning key sectors such as climate finance, small-medium enterprises, green tourism, transformation, as well as expansion of renewable energy projects under the NOFI program. The interconnectedness of the global financial architecture makes the challenge more complex, and development processes must follow the horizontal model, which is the true meaning of integrated development, where both infrastructure and human development are considered for better living standards. This is very obvious in the Decent Life Initiative, Haya Karima, and Takaful and Karama social protection programs. The member states recently adopted the Pact for the Future and committed to many actions, including deeper reforms of the international financial architecture, strengthening the multilateral response to support countries with high unsustainable debt burdens, improving the sovereign debt architecture, and many others. This indeed requires more resources and partnerships, and of course, increasing the voice of developing countries within the MDBs and globally. Furthermore, an incompatibility with various global initiatives, Egypt, through the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development and International Cooperation, has launched its first integrated national financing strategy on the sidelines of the 79th session of the United Nations General Assembly last September in New York. The strategy promotes sustainable development as defined in Egypt's Vision 2030 through mobilizing innovative and sustainable finance to close the financing gap and minimize future fiscal and debt risks through bunch of financial mechanisms that, anchored by multi-stakeholder partnerships, pioneer debt swaps for development programs and country platforms. Also, it focuses on measuring the financing gap for the 7 priority sectors such as social protection, health, education, transportation, women's empowerment, sanitation, and climate change. It comes as part of the new operational framework for the economic development that aims at achieving the quality growth and underpinned by 3 key drivers. First, using data-driven and evidence-based policy to address sectoral development gaps, to invest in human capital, industrial development, SMEs, tech, entrepreneurship, and more. Second, building a future-resilient economy to ensure macroeconomic stability and implement structural reforms that foster competitiveness, macro-fiscal resilience, and green transitions. And third, optimizing resource allocation through an integrated framework that mobilizes domestic and international financing for priority sectors that accelerate progress towards SDGs. It is worth mentioning as well that Egypt's COP27 presidency, we launched 2 prominent initiatives. First, the Sharm el-Sheikh Guidebook for Just Financing, which applies 12 core principles focusing on making international finance fairer, ensuring that funding aligns with both global and national goals, and bolsters the resilience of developing economies. Second is Egypt's country platform for the nexus of water, food, and energy, our NOFI program, which aims to accelerate the national climate agenda and provides opportunities for mobilizing climate finance and private investments to support Egypt's green transition, reflecting the interlinkages and the complementarity between climate action and development efforts. And let me here mention that we were able to mobilize close to $3 billion in the renewable sector under Egypt's country platform, NOFI. I would like to conclude by emphasizing that Egypt is committed to strengthening its partnerships with the government of Spain, INFF facility parties, bilateral and multilateral development partners towards the operationalization of the integrated national financing strategy, and to exchange successful practices with different countries through agile South-South and triangle cooperation platforms. Thank you for having me today, and I look forward to our upcoming discussions and preparatory sessions during 2025, including the INFF Partner Dialogue and the Financing for Development Forum in New York in April 2025, on the path towards the 4th International Financing for Development Forum in Seville. Once again, thank you, and I wish you all a very happy and prosperous new year.
Thanks, and she was actually with us in person in Addis Ababa, where she talked in detail about some of the INFF issues as well. So I'm now going to go to Antti Karhunen, the Director for Sustainable Finance from the European Commission. The EU has been a long-standing champion of INFFs and is also actively engaged in country platforms on climate and energy transitions. How should these be connected, and how can FfD4 help?
To join you for this important panel. Indeed, I'd just like to start by saying that the EU confirms our strong support to the use of integrated national financial framework and aligning financial flows, domestic and international, public and private, with the SDGs. The FfD4 can really help reinforce the need for alignment of international support with national financing priorities, and the countries can use their INF to align multilateral and bilateral development partners such as MDBs as well as the private sector. The sustainable development, climate, environment, and biodiversity challenges are really interdependent and require mobilizing additional finances. And INFs can lead the way towards mobilizing the needed resources. It is impressive to see the increased number of countries using the INF to develop financing strategies. The second point is incentivizing and mobilizing and scaling up private finance is really essential to achieve the SDGs and close the global investment gap. So MDBs have a strategic role to engage in a more systematic way with the private sector by engaging in risk-sharing initiatives to scale up sustainable investments and increase private capital mobilization. And we need to scale up the use of innovative financial instruments, such as use of proceeds, thematic bonds, and structures such as public-private investment vehicles and funds, which aim at crowding in institutional investors. And with our EU Global Gateway strategy and the EFSD Plus guarantees and blended finance, as well as on sustainable finance incentives like Global Green Bond Initiative and Sustainable Finance Advisory Hub, we are just doing that and indeed try to scale up this activity. It's also, in this context, very important to underline the importance of the conducive environment for private investment. And the EU is very strong in this space. We support favorable framework conditions, enhancing transparency and good governance and building up capacities and skills. And we are also, together with the UNDP, our good partner, working very much on credible sustainable finance frameworks and promoting their interoperability. And these are all issues that are also very high in the FfD4 agenda, and we are happy to see them in the elements paper. So indeed, we are really happy to see that INFFs are more and more including strong components linked to sustainable finance. And as countries make progress with INFFs, we are further really happy to join in for relevant financing reforms and engage in support, for example, on TA or through our budget support tools in areas like domestic resource mobilization and taxation reforms. And third point, financial architectures at national and international level should really be mutually reinforcing. So in this regard, we have been very vocal to call for more collaboration at country level among all stakeholders, improving the implementation of country platforms and also strengthening co-financing activities. So there should be a strong partnership and cooperation among the MDBs to work better as a system, as well as closer cooperation with other multilateral organizations, and in particular the UN and with the national public development banks. So we encourage MDBs to find synergies around country-owned platforms to strengthen collaboration and co-financing, and as well as with country-led INFFs to maximize impact on the SDGs. And we welcome really for example, in this regard, the co-financing platform that is now hosted with the World Bank Group to promote synergies between MDBs, and it's a very good example. So working together at country level as well as global fora on scaling up sustainable investments is in short much more important than crucial than ever. To better work together with help partner countries, it's important to have an active dialogue and good exchanges between the UN resident coordinators and local World Camp Group and IMF offices and other MDB officers represented at country level. And so we welcome if this dialogue can be sort of a nice beginning for precisely that operation that we need both at country level but also between our headquarters. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, Harry.
Hey, thanks so much for those comments and thoughts from the EU's perspective. And Tom Bello, Director of Sustainable Finance Hub from UNDP. What is your experience to date working with IFIs in support and response to INFFs? And how can the FfD4 process and its outcome provide an opportunity to enhance connection going forward?
Thanks, Shari, and it's great to have this opportunity to have such a meaningful discussion of how to collaborate further across integrated national financing frameworks and other such platforms like the MDB country platforms. I think there are two ways to answer that question, Shari, around how do I look at the collaboration so far. At the country level, let me put it very simply, where ministries of finance or governments ask for the UN and the IFIs to collaborate around integrated national financing frameworks, we do. And in many ways, that's the whole philosophy, raison d'etre of a country-led approach to financing sustainable development. We put the government in the driver's seat and we are there in the passenger's seat together to support the government in their approach. I would add another dimension to it, speaking frankly in a room like this. Of course, it's also enabled by relationships at the country level. We all know that relationships in any context can be favourable to more constructive engagements or unfavourable to constructive engagements. And in that regard, the collaboration can be quite ad hoc. When we look across the 86 countries where integrated national financing frameworks are being developed and or implemented by governments, some half of them involve collaboration between the international finance institutions and UN in support of those INFFs. And they take many different forms, those collaborations. And let me just run through a set of examples to give you a bit of the landscape. In Tunisia, for example, the World Bank and UNDP co-convened finance dialogues to inform the development of the country's INFF. In Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, ADB, the Asian Development Bank, and UNDP did joint diagnostics to inform the INFF. In Bangladesh, the IMF used the Integrated National Financing Framework and the Climate Change Fiscal Framework within the INFF as a policy trigger for lending $1.4 billion through the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. In Tanzania, the IFC joined in the implementation of the INFF in supporting corporate green and social bond issuance. The list goes on. The forms of collaboration are different in each of those contexts. In some cases, perhaps easier wins in collaboration, like diagnostics or co-convening dialogues. In others, looking more at the finance instruments and solutions that support the implementation of INFFs. I think the minister from Egypt also gave another example of where she and the government of Egypt have developed an INFF and a country platform. And she articulated how that country platform was mobilizing climate finance to support the development plan and the overall INFF. I would say moving forward in the context of FfD4, we have a real opportunity to move from what is ad hoc, perhaps perchance collaboration across the UN and international finance institutions in support of country-led process to a much more deliberate design of that alignment and support. And the FFD process is in many ways the ideal process to bring development institutions such as those of the UN and finance institutions such as the multilateral development banks together in the context of financing for development. So moving ahead, I hope we can secure an even more ambitious commitment across all actors to align and support country-led financing plans for sustainable development. Thank you, Sharon.
Great, thanks, Tom, and really interesting examples, which is a good segue to our next speaker, senior economist from the World Bank. And from the World Bank's perspective, what would you say are the main features of a successful country platform or INFF? And how does the World Bank engage?
Thank you for inviting World Bank to this important panel. I'm honored to be here. Okay, let me start with the definition, as many of you might have already known. A country platform is generally defined as a voluntary country-led level mechanism set out by governments and designed to foster collaboration among development partners based on a shared strategic vision and priorities. It's a collaborative framework that brings together governments, international organizations, the private sector, the other key shareholders to align financial resources, technical expertise, and policy reforms for development projects in individual countries. INFF is another way to coordinate assistance in countries. And for the World Bank, the main feature for successful platforms or coordination arrangements is that they are country-owned and country-led. This has been a key to the success in several cases. It's very clear in the case of Egypt, for example, that we just heard in video. I wish I could say in front of her, but the role of the World Bank in a country platform will vary across countries and by the request of the country. Driven by the scope and depth of its dialogue and experience, the configuration and capacity of other stakeholders and resource availability. There is no one-size-fits-all platform across countries, as well as there is no preset role for World Bank across platforms. But we will always follow the principle of country ownership for our involvement. The World Bank supports countries on the coordination arrangements that they consider most appropriate. We support INFFs or country platforms or just bilateral coordination at their request. Our priorities to engage are defined through the World Bank Group Country Partnership Framework, which is the document that in each country guides our engagement and is done in a consultative way, including with partners like the United Nations, other MDBs, or other donors. More specifically, World Bank's participation ranges from participation as members of INFF oversight committees to technical assistance in different coordination processes, including public expenditure and financial accountability, public expenditure reviews, SDG costing assessments, and engagement in financial dialogues. For example, in Mongolia, World Bank is providing technical assistance to strengthen public financial management. In Uzbekistan, UNDP and World Bank partnered on the implementation of the government's performance-based budgeting reforms. In Rwanda, the World Bank is providing development policy financing to support the implementation of the government's national strategy, which INFF assesses and diagnoses. In addition to Egypt's country platform, I'd like to highlight Tunisia as another example to conclude. This may be useful to illustrate the type of platform activities we support. Tunisia operationalizes its country platform through a $6 million Tunisia Compact specific multi-donor trust fund, which since 2018 has financed, among other things, including the consolidation of reform matrices and budget support, the coordination of investment lending, technical assistance for specific reforms like PPP, feasibility studies, and private sector engagement activities. And this is guided by Tunisia's National Development Plan. Tunisia is also part of the G20 Compact with Africa initiative, co-chaired by Germany and South Africa. And this platform experience and further developments related to reforms to mobilize the private sector were presented in knowledge exchanges to other compact countries. We believe it's crucial for countries to take ownership and share the lessons they've learned from their experiences. The World Bank will accompany while they are always in the driver's seat for these initiatives to be successful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. And I think it's really great to hear how everyone's working together, and also the attitude of, as I thought, Tom, the country's in the driver's seat and everyone's in the back seat working together when they're invited into the car. And so it's really up to the countries to lay this out, to put forward these processes and invite the support of the institutions. So thank you so much. We're now Helga Zeitler, the Deputy Director General from BMZ in Germany. Germany has highlighted its commitment to the G20 framework for voluntary support to INFFs and is also actively engaged in country platforms through a number of just energy transition partnerships, for example. How can the FfD4 outcome foster deeper connections to mobilize financing for sovereign priorities at the country level?
Thank you, Shari, and great to be here. And thanks really to the hosts, both Spain and the INFF facility, for bringing us all together. All the key players are in the room, so that's very good. As was said, I mean, the development of the INFF approach was really an important outcome of Addis, and we think the requirement of all sources of financing coming together and to support and align for concrete strategies for sustainable development is really what we're still all struggling with, and how we try to overcome the remaining enormous gaps in mobilization of these resources. So for us, we've been very committed to support the methodological development of INFFs and their implementation through the SDG Joint Fund, together also with the EU. And I mean, there has been really impressive progress over the last years. It's becoming an increasingly important tool to foster policy coherence at national level, at international level. But of course, I mean, there are also challenges, that's clear. It's a complex process at national level. I think Shari also pointed to the need for country ownership, otherwise it just doesn't work. And there also have been questions around sufficient inclusiveness at national level. So, I mean, there are many things we still need to work on. Nevertheless, I think a lot has happened and there's been a lot of progress. So we remain committed to the G20 voluntary framework, as you said, and we, for example, recently supported a case study by UNDP on Indonesia's INFF, focusing on innovative financing tools. We're also working with UNDP in the context of the climate promise, for example, of linking NDC development and INFFs, another very important way of bringing different elements together. And FfD4, I mean, having all the stakeholders there can really be a very important place to advance the coherence of the development finance ecosystems. And for us, that's a priority, to better have coordination of all actors, donors, development banks, and the private sector for this alignment that we need to achieve and that remains so challenging, and to increase the efficiency of development cooperation. So yeah, we are supporting country platforms, in particular also ChatPs, and like INFFs, they are based on the idea that private and public financial contributions can be more than just the sum of the parts if they come together in a platform and if they contribute to an overarching strategy and to advance a just transition. The G20 Brazilian presidency's task force on climate ministerial statement made that very clear, that the country platforms must build on strong country-led national transition planning. And that's exactly, again, the point of the importance of country ownership. So in our input to the FfD4 elements paper, we've also highlighted this, and we've encouraged to evaluate synergies of INFFs with the country platforms. such as the platforms initiated by the World Bank and other MDBs and the JETPs. We welcome very much that the MDBs have come out with a joint concept paper on country platforms. We think that's a very important step, and FfD4 can take on that basis this even further and advance the coherence and help us avoid duplications and proliferations of platforms. So that's really a very, very encouraging step to see. The recent report by the INFF facility highlights some good examples of alignment between country platforms and INFFs. A good example is, from our perspective, in Senegal. But we think there's still potential to embed this aspect in the methodology more systematically. And so we welcome also the input from the INFF facility to the elements paper that mentions exactly this need for better alignment between the country platforms and the IMFF. Just maybe a word on the elements paper that we're now discussing this week. It takes up quite prominently the aspect of inclusive nationally led platforms for improved country-level coordination, putting them at the heart of the collaboration between the MDBs and the development partners. And this is language that we support very much, including all relevant actors, MDBs, PDBs, the UN system, bilateral partners, and if need be, the private sector and others. So we will keep on supporting this strongly together with the EU, of course, in the further negotiations for the outcome of FfD4. And we would also like to really highlight the important role of civil society in all of this. It's a point that should still feature. System coherence is quite strongly focused on in the elements paper, and that is again something that is a priority for us in Germany. So it remains a learning process, this whole endeavor of bringing INFFs forward and linking them with the country platforms. We think the next steps to advance this is to get more experiences from the partner countries and how this actually works on the ground with the coordination of the different actors, with the use of the country platforms. And we should build on the experience of the MDBs with the country platforms and on the experiences of the INFF facility with the implementation of the INFFs. So if we can bring all of this together, I think at FfD4 we can really take a step further. Thank you.
That's great, thanks. And FFD historically, since Monterey, has been about coherence.
Yep.
It's been about trying
Exactly.
to bring these different parts together and see and increase the coherence. So great to hear all of this. And definitely it's all a learning process. So a learning process for planning, a learning process for country platforms. This is all, everyone's constant is really learning as we move forward and making things, building off of that knowledge. So I'm now going to Andrew Masters, the Deputy Division Chief from the IMF. And the question is, how is the IMF, which part of the IMF are you from?
Revenue Administration, Fiscal Affairs.
Fiscal Affairs, Deputy Division Chief Fiscal Affairs, IMF. I actually know that, so I don't know why I asked that to you, but how it's a long day, yeah, long week. How is the IMF supporting INFFs and country platforms, and how can FfD4 strengthen responses to sovereign financing priorities?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. My apologies from Juan Toro, who would have liked to have been here himself. If I may, I'd like to highlight some practical aspects that are critical to success but are often overlooked and have a bearing on INFFs. Some of the aspects have already been mentioned, but I'd like to look at 6 that are really important. And again, I'm looking at this from a revenue administration perspective, but they have broader application beyond just revenue administration. The first that is critical is ownership, and that's already been touched on. It's, of course, important for the government to own the reforms and to be responsible in the management of those reforms. But a practical issue here is we often find that particularly low-capacity countries don't have the capacity to develop policies fully, and they also don't have the capacity to draft legislation. And this often becomes a bit of a bottleneck, and there's always a temptation for organisations such as ourselves to try to jump in and actually do it on behalf of the government. And I think there needs to be a very delicate balance between what we do as international organizations and what the country does. We can certainly assist, but we should never take ownership for something that belongs to the government itself. We also notice that there's actually quite a significant gap between the plan and implementation. It seems to stall at the kind of, plan's complete, everyone, sighs with relief and says, let's take a bow, and the implementation is actually the hard part. And we've seen this particularly with medium-term revenue strategies. We get to the planning phase, and often there's quite a significant time lag between the plan and actually starting to do anything. Stakeholder engagement is another critical practical aspect, something that countries themselves are not good at, and we're not brilliant at it either. We certainly have, over the past 5 or so years at the IMF, become more conscious of it, and we've been working very hard to engage ourselves. But I think particularly at the government level, intergovernmental cooperation often is quite difficult to see. Certainly engagement with civil society is quite difficult. Putting legislation with no explanatory notes on a website saying you've got 30 days to make comments really isn't engaging with civil society. It needs to be much more than that. The communication around what government is trying to do is vital. And there has to be a consultation process, and you can't just say, well, let's meet and then not take any of the input from stakeholders into consideration, merely march along. Political factors impact progress. We find that as elections come up, at least 6 months before and 6 months after, everything grinds to a halt, and nothing much happens. We also see that when key leaders and institutions get changed frequently, it creates instability and uncertainty, and again, there's a degree of inertia that comes with that. So, an example that I can think of in revenue administration is there have been 8 commissioners general over a period of 5 years. Now, that just doesn't, lend itself to see much progress in that particular revenue administration. Obviously, when governments changes, the best case scenario is that the reform process and plans are tweaked a little bit at the margins. The worst case scenario is that it gets thrown out and one starts all over again. And we have to be conscious of that, and we need to be, as institutions, talking to the IMF particularly, we need to be quite adept at adapting to changing circumstances. We need to be much more agile than we often are. Governance frameworks for reform programs in countries are often not very strong. Capacity is not there, a very vital aspect that is often overlooked. The other point that I'd like to make is reform progress is not uniform, and it can actually be uneven most often than not, in the sense that one institution might be doing quite a bit and there may well be a whole lot of attraction, and in another there's no traction and reform's not going anywhere. We need to be aware of that, and we need to try to redirect the emphasis, particularly if it's critical on what's been well done in one institution. Of course, development partner coordination is vital. It's been said before, I think it's important that the government takes the lead in coordinating and planning and sequencing. But I think it's important that partners also meet more frequently than they do. I don't think it's good enough to meet in country or have a conversation with whoever is in country. I think there should be something a lot more formal than that, to see how best we can coordinate our efforts. I think often countries sort of shop around and ask for the same capacity development from multiple parties. don't think that that's terribly useful, particularly when resources all around are relatively limited. When it comes to what the IMF has been doing, I think just before I move on to that, the other thing that I feel is quite important. We all have diagnostic tools, but we often don't know what the other party's diagnostics are. If I look at the Fiscal Affairs Department, between revenue administration, tax policy, expenditure policy, and PFM, we have umpteen different tools. I couldn't even explain them all myself, particularly those in areas that I'm not an expert. But I'm pretty certain that I have very little understanding of what tools other organisations, other institutions have, and I do think that it makes no sense for us to repeat diagnostic work. I do think that we all have our niche areas, but I do think that we can adapt diagnostics that have already been carried out much more effectively, save time and effort, and actually be more productive than just repeating what we do as institutions. I think just in terms of some of the examples of collaboration where the IMF is involved, of course there's the platform for collaboration in tax, which is UN, IMF, World Bank, and OECD. The MTRS, medium-term revenue strategy, is an important part of that. We've recently started to work more closely with the World Bank. We have the joint domestic resource mobilization initiative, where we look in as institutions to plan together at the start before we even get into the field and then start collaborating, but rather do the collaboration at a much earlier stage. And then an interesting one, of course, that as a revenue administrator is interesting to me, is the International Survey on Revenue Administration. We gather data from revenue administrations from 169 countries, and that's a really good example of collaboration between the Asian Development Bank, the OECD, and IOTA, the Intra-European Organization for Tax Administration, and CIAT, the Center for Inter-American Taxation, and ourselves. So these are some of the areas. It's not an exhaustive list, but there's certainly scope for much more collaboration as we go forward. Thank you.
Thanks for, again, some good examples, scope for collaboration, and also for going through some of the challenges on the ground that really have to be addressed, and reminding everyone of how challenging it can be on the ground, but nonetheless how we have to move forward and try the best we can to address these challenges and move through them. So I'm going now to our final speaker, to Karsten Starr, the chair of the OECD DAC. So Karsten, over to you. Oh, wait, question. Development effectiveness is regaining attention as the FfD4 process advances and it's featured in the Elements paper. How can FfD4 enhance alignment and country ownership across both bilateral and multilateral development partners?
Thank you very much. And of course, being the last speaker in this very distinguished panel also gives me some prerogative of having been able to listen to others. So I will not repeat, but maybe also to answer your question, when you listen to the discussion, it's very clear that what Monique has started introducing, how can we bring INF together with country platform? There are a lot of sympathy around here, and hopefully we can do that. But my plea will also be why it's important to do that, and why country leadership and ownership is more important now than ever, why we need to have this kind of collaboration, and I'll start with that. The 8 effectiveness principles, we adopted them in 2005, almost 20 years ago. We'll celebrate next year. And at the time, of course, country ownership, alignment, harmonization was very much the talk of the town. I was head of DANIDA, the Danish Aid Development Operation at the time, and I recall that we initiated a blockbuster presentation of the outcome of the Aid Effectiveness Conference in Paris under the heading, "We will always have Paris." And of course, we all know that Humphrey Bogart lost Ingrid Bergman on the way, and to a large degree, we have lost the direction initiated by the effectiveness principle. I think that analysis needs to be very much, and that, of course, is the basis for this discussion. Fragmentation, you mentioned that, a number of you, also you, Sherry, a major problem, and we see that. Basically, average transaction diminished. We have a lot of data from the OECD, from the World Bank on these issues. Proliferation of partners, less depth in cooperation, and so on. It's very clear. We know that some developing countries have dozens, if not hundreds, of partners, development agencies working there to create a lot of confusion. And we also, and that's some of the other data that we do have, that funding outside partner government budgets is basically increasing. What is delivered, share of ODA delivered directly to government budgets has dropped from over a decade from 60% to 38%, basically. Partly because an increased share of bilateral ODA is now channeled through the UN system for a number of reasons that I should not go into, and partly because ODA is now channeled through other partners in local societies than the government. So that creates a situation where if we are to address that, and I think that not all of the development we've seen since Addis has been positive ones, and I think we need to reboot the effectiveness principles. We need to, as donors, individually and together, to take some course correction on that. If we are to do that, it's incredibly important to have a strong country coordination, country ownership mechanism at the anchor of this. So that's the plea then basically is that if there are competing instruments, and if we are seeing increasingly a contest to shape country coordination between various actors, it's really important to get that problem solved and create that true, genuine country ownership that we are missing. Just one example of this, and I'm still at the same time maybe promoting a bit of what the OECD DAC is doing right now. We are looking at how we can improve the ODA graduation process. When countries reach the level of high-income countries, they lose their basically, they cannot no longer be entitled to receive ODA or eligible for ODA. And so we try now to look at that because it creates problems for some countries that go through the graduation process, and we see how we can actually create a more smooth transition in many ways without basically questioning the criteria for this. And that of course also contains the idea to build very strongly on country strategies to align, to accelerate efforts to mobilize all kinds of support to ensure financial stability in context of graduation. You cannot do this without a very strong country platform and strong country ownership. INFF is excellent in that context. So I think what we do need here, it's very good to hear that everybody agrees in principle that the interest of countries need to be very much at the center. I'm sure that I hope that also that the FfD4 will be able to really reboot the country ownership, focus on development cooperation. We need simple, effective, result-delivering, country-led coordination mechanisms that can take on board all partners, no matter whether they are bilateral donors, MDBs, or UN partners. And that also, of course, and that's the difficult part, needs to make sure that all partners take their own institutional interest and put that on the back seat. I've been in Texas and surrounding states for a week, so I know that it's not simple that you have a front seat and a back seat. You also have a load in most of the cars where you can put a lot of those that doesn't matter. But I think we need to be able to basically not only the driver's seat, but we also need to include everybody. So that kind of subsiding your own institutional interest to the country interest, I think that will be the important thing here. So it's a plea for all the the competing systems that we have in place here to work together, to come together, to subside and to accept the country ownership, and to be sure that we have something that can work forward. Thank you.
That's a great way to end the speaker part, with a plea to us to put our institutional interests on the side. Yes, and a very well taken one. So we have around 10 minutes, I think. So I think we'd all love to hear from people. If you're sitting in the back, you can come up to one of the speakers or just talk really loudly. And I really hope that I see many faces in the room who I know have lots to say on these issues. So really hope that some people have some thoughts that they want to share. Yes? No? Yes, great.
Thank you so much. So good afternoon. I'm Natalia Windrossi. I'm the Director of Social Policy and Social Protection in UNICEF, and of course I'm also a partner of the INFF facility. And I just wanted to come in the conversation because I think we've been talking about alignment. We're talking about bringing different elements together. And I think the reason why UNICEF was very keen to be part of this partnership is because many times we forget the social sector elements of the equation. And I think there's been a very important work and complementarity between UNDP, OECD, UNDESA, and others on bringing the climate perspective, the economic perspective, but also that very important social element, and how we can definitely bring and align different sources of financing to make sure that from one side we make social sectors more equitable, more transparent, more stronger, but also we are asking governments to do more with limited resources. So what are the different ways to also make sure that we have more impact? And I think the other part of our work, I think leveraging a little bit our country presence and food presence was around not only working at a national level, but also enhancing the local level financing frameworks, which I think is another key element that I think we need to collectively maybe make more visible in the road towards FfD4. I think we're talking a lot about national engagement, which is key, but I think there's a lot and many that is actually done at some national level, a municipal level, a community level, and how we can engage that. And the last point, if you allow me, is how do we make these structures work in contexts that right now are impacted by fragility, by complex emergencies? How are we going to adapt also these mechanisms of financing to be able to have more stronger contingency financing mechanisms or other types of interventions that could address that? And I think this is an area where still are struggling, or what is the best way to strengthen public finance and private finance mechanisms in contexts that are dealing with complex emergencies, constant struggles to address not only economic crisis, but also conflict, displacement, and others. And I think this is an area that we need, I think, to put our heads together and what does it mean to make public systems also work in those kinds of contexts. So I just wanted to add those three elements. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And you've actually hit on a few of the issues that have actually come up in the question of strengthening them in the elements paper that have already come up. One is the issue of social. So that was discussed, but it wasn't. It was in the last version. It was, but it will. I'm sure we'll be back in the zero draft. Another that several comments we've heard is this question of we don't really use the term fragility in the UN, but at least in the Secretariat, but this question of conflict affected. And that's a really tricky one. I mean, certainly when we're talking about planning, it's very hard for countries in conflict to have strong plans, but also there's this question of, even when we talk about a lot of the instruments and thinking about development effectiveness of, trying to have instruments that also strengthen governance while they are doing what else they're doing, but that have an impact to strengthen the national governance as well. And then again, that's something really difficult when you think of it in a conflict context. So I guess there's a real, thinking through what's a very different world. But these are two things that have come up already several times in thinking about bringing them more strongly into the elements paper. So I'm sure it's things for the co-facilitators to consider. Did anybody else want to? Great, yes.
Yes, hi, I'm Glenn from UNDESA.
Do you want to come here, Glenn, and talk into the mic? The people online who are hearing this or no?
Okay, my question basically is around the role of data and more integrated coherency around the financing flows data. And I know that in some countries there was an attempt to kind of create sort of integrated dashboards or different mechanisms to bring together a lot of the data. So where is that discussion going within the next phase of INFF? Where are there examples where that has been used to kind of allow decision makers to have better real informed data for decision making on SDG financing?
Great, thanks. And Carsten, did you have your mic on, or that wasn't?
No. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, now it's on. Okay. Now it's on, so you can turn it
I'm
off.
sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Are there anybody else who has questions that they want to pose? Great, good. I was about to start calling on people, but...
Wait, is he on? Okay, thank you. Thanks, Sherry. Thanks for bringing us all together in this room and talk about this very important issue. I'm Luigi Larai. I work with the board of the director of the World Bank. From what I gather from today's meetings, there's a lot of awareness of what the problems are. Unfortunately, some of the problems are well known, they're well established. We heard them before, so I guess a thought-provoking question would be, how is this going to change after Seville? I think this is a question we have to ask ourselves. I think that's the homework that we have to do going to Seville and post-Seville, of course, not that the event will solve, but I think we really need to think in terms of solutions to these problems, to these bottlenecks. Another issue that I'd like to mention, and many issues being mentioned, Andrea, especially the issue of skills and gaps of capacity, the nexus of humanitarian and development. I think that's still at the heart of the issues. In terms of fragmentations, in terms of coordination mechanism at country level. We heard a lot from many of you. Many of the speakers mentioned that contrasting priorities. How do we marry these priorities? Carsten, you mentioned, you quoted Casablanca. I quote all the president's men, follow the money, in terms of maybe understanding some of the conflicting priorities that exist on the ground. But anyway, these are my 2 points that I want to posit to you. Thank you.
Really good points and really good questions. The one after Seville, I think that's because Seville is just a moment, and hopefully the outcome is a frame that can help set things in motion, but then it's up to everyone to set them in motion. So we hope the board is looking at and reading the elements paper and thinking about what makes sense to them and what that means for them going forward, et cetera. So I don't know if there are, we can go back to, yeah, please, go ahead. Hi.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you. Now, I just wanted to bring to the conversation, you might be aware, but this is country platforms in particular is one of the areas where MDBs have been also discussing and coordinating to work as a system. And in particular, last November, there was a note published with principles in particular on country platforms. And I think that they are very well aligned with the things that have been discussed here: political commitment and country ownership, investment needs, transparency, but also a last dimension, which is the one of mobilizing finance. So I think the question that I may have is both for the INFFs and for the country platforms, how do you see the existence and creation of the platform themselves as also being an opportunity, a trigger, a facilitator of additional resources, concessional and donor eventually in terms of implementation of the goals of the platforms. Great. Thank you.
So I think those are really good questions, and we can go back to our speakers. I don't know, did you want to add anything? No. Okay, so Tom, why don't you go? There are lots of questions for you.
Well, I don't know if they were for me, Shari, but I won't be able to do justice to any of them, let alone all of them. But let me just say two things, if you'll allow me, Shari. And I wanted to just pick up on the governance connection here, because I think we're all hearing a lot about a crisis of trust in institutions and an erosion of the social contract. And actually the efforts around the integrated national financing framework, to me, are at the core of strengthening trust in institutions and the social contract. And as international actors, we have a duty to support country-led efforts at financing their sustainable development, because if we undermine those efforts or distort those efforts, we're also creating and further enhancing that crisis of trust in institutions and erosion of social contracts. So I really just wanted to emphasize that the INFF is at core a governance issue, not just a finance issue. There was a question about data and statistics, and we did have an event yesterday looking at the role of data and statistics in strengthening fiscal policy, in this case, coherence for sustainable development. And I know it's a strong part of the Addis Ababa action agenda, but I really think in the outcome document in Spain, we could bring data and statistics from the end, as it was in Addis, to an integrated part of endeavors around finance for development, including in relation to the INFF.
And so right now in the elements paper, there is a call for strengthening data in part of the follow-up of FfD4. So that would be, something that hopefully we'll see how that goes. And then, I don't know, Nobuhisa, did you want to say anything? Or anything? Yeah.
Question about the data. So as is mentioned right now, so the MDB is working as a system for development effectiveness. So as in terms of data, MDBs released 2 new publications through the Global Emerging Risk Database. It's called GEMS, consortium with more granular statistics, providing investors further insights on credit risk in emerging markets and developing economies, which is a kind of data to support countries. And for further financing, the MDBs launched a co-financer portal with opportunities to increase partnerships in 125 projects worth over 95 billion, and we have to move it forward, including mobilizing more private capital resources. So that's what we need to do as MDBs.
Great, thank you. And I don't know, Karsten, did you want to add anything? Okay.
Well, maybe just one point. I just wanted to thank Natalia actually for raising 2 important issues. One on social. I think that is also encouraging to hear that will come back, maybe. Because I think INFFs can really also play a good role in addressing very complex issues, like, for example, also on inequality, right? I mean, there's so many different elements that need to be looked at, and I think through INFFs you can really look at the different policies and bring that together, and that allows really for a better policy making and the alignment of the relevant flow. So thanks for flagging that, and also for the fragile context. We use the term a lot in the EU. You may use
the whole UN system except for the Secretariat.
Okay, I'm learning. That's good to know, but I still think, I mean, it's a complex exercise to do a full-fledged one, but I still think that the core logic can also do serve a big purpose in a context of fragility, and I think there's a version of that can take you to greater policy coherence also in countries like that. So I think there's something to be made use of even in that situation.
Great. Well, thanks for all of those ideas and for the really excellent interventions. It was really great to hear. First, to have really in itself a big accomplishment. Congratulations, Tom, on doing that. And then also to hear the interventions and to see so much that there's a lot of agreement on country plans, country ownership, development effectiveness, strengthening it, and really bringing and dealing with all these issues. So I really think the questions now is how do we move forward, and what steps do we take, and how do we get FfD4 to be really the outcome and the discussion around the outcome to be strong, to really move this agenda forward. So that's really in all of your hands. So I finally want to thank the government of Spain, the INFF facility partners, and our distinguished panelists for their insights and leadership and shaping a more ambitious FFD outcome. So thank you all.
Thank you.